The knock came 3 times, slow and deliberate, the kind of knock that did not belong to a neighbor borrowing salt or a child lost in the dark. Sadie's hand stilled over the wash basin. Water dripped from her fingers onto the dirt floor of the small cottage, and for a moment she did not breathe at all, only listened, the way she had trained herself to listen every night for the last 3 years. Footsteps outside, heavy ones, boots that did not belong to anyone in this village. She turned her head toward the corner where her daughter slept, curled beneath a wool blanket too thin for the coming winter, dark lashes resting against a cheek still soft with childhood. 4 years old. Safe, for now, in a dream Sadie could not see, and would have given anything to protect. The knock came again. She crossed the room without sound, the way the old woman who'd taken her in had taught her. Heel first, weight low, breath shallow. She pressed her palm flat against the door, not to open it, but to feel whatever waited on the other side. And what she felt, through old wood and colder air, was a presence so vast it made her knees go weak. She knew that presence. She had spent 3 years trying to forget the shape of it, the weight of it, the way it used to settle over her like a second skin whenever he was near. "I know you're in there," the voice said, low, controlled, not a shout, not a threat, just a fact, stated the way kings stated facts, because kings did not need to raise their voices to be obeyed. "I can smell you, Sadie." Her name in his mouth again, after 3 years of silence, undid something in her chest she had spent 3 years rebuilding. She did not answer. Behind her, her daughter stirred, murmured something small and wordless, and went still again. Sadie's eyes burned. She thought of the morning she'd left the capital with nothing but a borrowed cloak and a belly just beginning to round. Thought of the letter she'd been shown, the one with his seal pressed into red wax. The one that had told her, in his own hand, or so she'd believed, that she had been a mistake, a complication, something to be quietly removed, before it became inconvenient. She had believed it. She had run because of it. She had raised a child alone in a cottage on the edge of nowhere because of it. And now, the man whose name was on that letter stood outside her door at midnight, 3 years later, saying her name like it still belonged to him. "Open the door," he said, "or I will, and I'd rather not put my hand through it. The wood's older than it looks." There was something almost gentle beneath the command, which frightened her more than cruelty would have. Cruelty she understood. Cruelty she had survived. This careful restraint, she did not know how to fight. Sadie's hand found the small iron poker beside the hearth, more out of habit than belief that it would do anything against an alpha king. She held it anyway, because some part of her had decided long ago that she would not be found on her knees again. Not by him, not by anyone. She opened the door. He stood in the gray wash of moonlight, taller than memory had allowed, broader, his dark hair pulled back in braids damp from travel. A fur-lined cloak settled across shoulders that had once been the only place in the world she'd felt safe. There was a fresh scar along his cheekbone that hadn't been there before, and his eyes, pale, sharp, unreadable, moved over her face like he was relearning it, memorizing what 3 years had changed. "You look thinner," Alaric said quietly. "And afraid of me. I don't like either. You shouldn't be here." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Whatever you came to finish it somewhere your people won't be able to say you did it in front of a child." Something flickered across his face. Confusion, sharp and genuine. "Finish what?" "Don't." The word cracked out of her like a held breath finally released. "Don't stand there and pretend you don't know what you wrote to me. I kept the letter, Alaric. I kept it for 3 years because some foolish part of me thought I might need proof someday that I wasn't imagining the way you..." She stopped herself before the sentence went somewhere she couldn't take back. "What letter?" It wasn't a question. It was a demand. low and dangerous, and beneath it she heard something she hadn't expected to hear in his voice. Not anger at her, but a fury aimed somewhere else entirely. Somewhere just beginning to take shape. Behind her, soft footsteps. Small ones. "Mama?" Sadie's whole body turned to stone. She had not moved fast enough, had not shut the door fast enough, had not done any of the 1,000 small things she'd rehearsed for 3 years in case this exact moment ever came. Her daughter stood in the doorway of the back room, rubbing one eye with a small fist, hair the same dark shade as the man standing on the threshold, and eyes. Alaric's breath left him like he'd been struck. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply stood there, staring at a child who looked back at him with the unguarded curiosity of someone too young to understand why a stranger in a fur cloak had gone so suddenly, completely still, like the air itself had stopped moving around him. Sadie. His voice had changed entirely. It was no longer the voice of a king demanding entry. It was something smaller, something that sounded almost like fear. "Sadie, who is this?" She could lie. For one wild heartbeat, she considered it. Considered every excuse that might send him back into the night confused but gone. Considered protecting the last 3 years of careful, hard-won safety with one more careful, hard-won lie. But his eyes were already moving back and forth between the child's face and her own, doing the arithmetic no father could fail to do once he started looking. "This is my daughter," Sadie said, and her voice did not shake, though everything inside her did. "Mine. I raised her. I fed her. I kept her warm. I taught her to walk and to speak and to be brave, and I did all of it alone. Because I believed, because I was shown, that you wanted neither of us anywhere near you." Alaric's jaw tightened. The scar on his cheekbone seemed to pale against the sudden color draining from his face. "I never sent a letter. I held it in my hands. Then someone forged my seal, and someone in my own household let you believe I had cast you out like refuse. And someone has had 3 years to consider what I will do to them when I learn their name." His voice did not rise. It dropped instead, quiet and final, the way a blade was quiet before it fell. 3 years, Sadie. 3 years I searched for you. 3 years I was told you'd left, because you didn't want the burden of what loving me would mean. I believed that lie. I never imagined. His gaze dropped again to the small girl now stepping fully into the doorway, no longer rubbing her eyes, simply watching him with the frank, unfiltered attention of a child deciding whether a stranger was safe. "What's your name?" the girl asked him. Something in Alaric's controlled, kingly composure cracked entirely. He crouched slowly, lowering himself to her height, careful the way a man is careful with something he has only just learned he could break by moving too fast. "My name is Alaric," he said softly. "What's yours?" "Ren." He looked up at Sadie over the child's head, and in his eyes she saw 3 years of grief rewritten in an instant into something far more dangerous. Not for her, she understood now, watching the cold clarity settle into his face, for whoever had stood between them. For whoever had stolen 3 years from a man who had clearly never stopped looking. "We are not finishing any conversation tonight at your threshold," Alaric said, rising slowly, his voice steady again, the king reasserting himself over the wreckage of the man. "But we will finish it, and you will tell me everything you were told, and by whom. Because someone in my court has lied to a king and stolen his daughter, and that is not a debt that goes unpaid." Outside, beyond the small ring of firelight spilling from the open door, Sadie thought she saw movement at the edge of the trees. A shape too quick, too quiet, gone before she could be certain it had been there at all. She did not know yet that it had been. He did not force his way in. That surprised her more than anything else he'd done that night. Instead, Alaric stood at the threshold with the patience of a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that some doors had to be opened from the inside, or they meant nothing at all. "I'll wait," he said. "Outside, if you need that. Or by the fire, if you'll let me, because I have questions, and I suspect you have years of them." Sadie looked down at Wren, who was still watching the stranger with the unblinking curiosity particular to children who had not yet learned to be afraid of the right things. She thought of the iron poker still gripped loosely in her other hand, of the 3 years of silence she'd built like a wall around the both of them, and how one knock at midnight had reduced it all to splinters. "Inside," she said finally, "but you'll sit by the door, and you'll keep your voice low. She's not used to strangers, and I won't have her frightened in her own home. She has nothing to fear from me." He said it like a vow, and something in the gravity of it made Sadie's throat tighten despite herself. He folded himself onto the bench near the door, too large for the cottage, his presence filling the small room the way water fills whatever shape it's poured into. Wren, after a long moment of consideration, climbed onto the chair across from him, swinging her bare feet, entirely unbothered by the Alpha King sitting in her mother's kitchen at midnight. "Tell me," Alaric said quietly, once Sadie had settled the kettle over the coals and taken the seat farthest from him, "about the letter." She told him. She told him about the hand that had delivered it, not his personal courier, but a woman from the household staff, someone Sadie had trusted, someone who'd brought it to her sealed and grave-faced, claiming it came from the king's own study. She told him about the words inside, cruel and clinical, dismissing what had grown between them as a passing weakness, unbecoming of his crown, instructing her to disappear quietly before the court noticed and made a scandal of it. She told him she had cried only once over it, the night she packed the small bag she still owned, and that after that, she had simply survived, because surviving was the only thing left to do. Alaric listened without interrupting, his hands folded loosely between his knees, his jaw working occasionally like he was chewing on something bitter he refused to spit out in front of his daughter. When she finished, the silence that followed had teeth in it. "The woman," he said. "Describe her." Older, gray at the temples, she wore the sigil of the household stewardship on her collar. Something shifted behind his eyes, recognition, cold and immediate. "Greta. You know her. She has served my family for 20 years. She raised my younger sister." His voice had gone very flat, the way a man's voice goes flat when he is holding back something enormous. "She also despised the idea of an unbonded human woman in my house, long before there was ever a child to despise as well." Sadie's stomach turned. "You're saying she did this alone?" "I'm saying I intend to find out exactly who she did it for." He looked up, and for the first time that night, she saw something in his expression that wasn't grief or fury, but calculation. The look of a king assembling a battlefield in his mind. "There were others who wanted me bonded elsewhere. A political match. A pack alliance that would have strengthened the northern borders. My mother favored it. The council favored it. You were, forgive me for saying it plainly, an obstacle to a great many people's ambitions. So I was removed. So you were removed," he agreed grimly, "and I was lied to in such a way that I would never come looking. They knew me well enough to understand that if I believed you'd left because you didn't want me, I would respect that, however much it destroyed me. They knew the lie that would work." Wren, sensing perhaps that the air in the room had grown heavy in a way children always seemed to sense before adults admitted it, slid down from her chair and crossed to her mother's side, climbing into her lap without asking permission. Sadie wrapped an arm around her automatically, and watched Alaric's gaze follow the motion with something raw and unguarded. "I am not asking you to forgive 3 years," he said quietly. "I know better than that, but I am asking you to come back with me. Not tonight. I won't drag you anywhere in the dark like a thief reclaiming stolen property, but soon. Because my daughter, and his voice caught faintly on the word, like it was new and enormous in his mouth. "Has a place in my house that no one will ever again take from her. And you, Sadie, have a debt owed to you that I intend to see paid in full, publicly, in front of the same court that let this happen. And if I say no, then I will accept it," he said, though it clearly cost him to say so. "I will not force a crown onto a woman who doesn't want it, and I will not force a mother to live anywhere she doesn't choose. But I will still find Greta. I will still find whoever paid her. And Ren will still be known, whether you live beside me or 100 miles from me, as my blood and my heir, because that truth does not depend on where either of you sleeps at night." Sadie studied him in the firelight, searching his face for the calculation she expected to find, the angle, the manipulation, the thing that men in power always seem to want beneath their kindness. She did not find it. What she found instead unsettled her more. A man who looked like he had spent 3 years grieving something he didn't understand the shape of, and had just been handed the shape all at once, more than he knew how to hold. "I need time," she said finally. "I have built a life here, small, but mine. I won't uproot her for a man I haven't learned to trust again." "That's fair." He rose, careful not to startle Ren, who had already begun to drift against her mother's shoulder, eyelids heavy. "I'll return tomorrow, not to take you, to begin proving I mean what I've said." He paused at the door, looking back once. 3 years ago, I would have already ordered Greta dragged before the council, and the truth pulled out of her by morning. I'm not that man tonight. I'm trying to be the kind of man who deserves to be let back into this room. Tell me if I'm failing. "You're not failing," Sadie admitted, quiet and unwilling. "Yet." He left as silently as he'd come, and Sadie sat by the dying fire for a long time afterward, her daughter heavy and warm against her chest, listening to the wind move through the trees outside, and wondering whether the shape she'd seen at the tree line earlier had belonged to a guard he'd brought with him, or to someone else entirely, someone who had followed him here and did not want this reunion to end well. She did not sleep that night, and in the gray hour before dawn, she found the answer to that question waiting on her doorstep. A single black feather, placed with deliberate care on the threshold stone, the old mark of a pack enforcer claiming a warning had been delivered. She did not know yet whose enforcer it belonged to, but she understood, with the cold clarity of someone who had survived betrayal once already, that whoever had forged that letter 3 years ago was not finished, and that Alaric's return had not ended a danger. It had only announced the beginning of a new one. Alaric returned the next afternoon, but not alone, and not in the way Sadie expected. She heard the horses before she saw them. Not the single mount she'd anticipated, but several, hooves churning the muddy track that led to her cottage, and her hand had already found Ren's shoulder, already begun pulling her daughter behind her skirts, before she registered that the riders wore the deep green livery of the royal household, rather than anything resembling an attack. Alaric dismounted first, and behind him came a woman Sadie didn't recognize, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, dressed in the practical wool of someone who rode often and dressed for function rather than court, and an older man with a healer's satchel slung across his back, the kind of leather bag that smelled, even from a distance, of dried herbs and beeswax salve. "I brought a physician," Alaric said, before Sadie could ask. "Not because anything is wrong, because I don't know what 3 years alone has cost either of you, and I would rather know than guess." He gestured to the silver-haired woman. "And this is Etta. She served as nurse to my sister and me when we were children. I trust her with my life. I am asking you to trust her with theirs." Etta inclined her head, not with the deference of a servant, but with the steady assessment of someone who had spent decades reading rooms and people both. Her gaze moved to Ren, softened slightly, then returned to Sadie with something like understanding. "I'm not here to take anything from you," she said. "Only to see that the girls had proper care, and that you have too. I raised 2 motherless royal children once. I know what it costs a woman to do everything alone. Sadie's jaw was tight. Every instinct still braced for some trick buried beneath the kindness. But Wren had already crept forward, drawn by the bright copper kettle Etta carried, and the older woman knelt without hesitation to show her the etched pattern on its side. Birds in flight, wings caught mid-motion, and something in Sadie's chest loosened, just slightly, watching her daughter laugh at something so small. "Half an hour," Sadie said. "She doesn't go anywhere, I can't see her." "Of course," Alaric said, and meant it. While Etta settled with Wren near the hearth, and the physician asked Sadie quiet, careful questions about fevers and growth, and whether the girl had ever shown signs of early shifting. She hadn't, not yet, though Sadie had wondered, watching her daughter's eyes occasionally flash gold in candlelight. Alaric stood near the window with his back straight and his hands clasped, the posture of a man holding himself very still, because movement might let something else escape. "I spoke with Greta this morning," he said, once the physician had stepped outside to consult his notes, and Etta's attention was fully absorbed by Wren's chatter. "She is no longer in my household's employ. You dismissed her." "I imprisoned her," he corrected, voice low enough that the words wouldn't carry to the child by the fire. She did not deny forging the letter. She denied acting alone, which I expected because Greta has never had the imagination for treachery this elegant. Someone guided her hand. Who? She named no one outright, but she said something that troubles me more than a name would have. His jaw tightened. She said she was told it was for the good of the pack, that a human mate, and a child born of that bond, would have torn the alliance structures my father spent decades building. She said she believed she was protecting the kingdom. And you believe her? I believe she believes it. Alaric turned from the window, and the look on his face was the same cold calculation she'd seen the night before, sharpened now into something with an edge. Which means someone with enough standing to convince a 20-year servant that treachery was patriotism is still inside my court, still trusted, still positioned to do this again if they sense the threat returning. Sadie wrapped her arms around herself, though the room wasn't cold. You're saying I'm in danger again. We are. I'm saying I won't pretend otherwise to spare your feelings. He crossed the room, stopping a respectful distance away, close enough to speak quietly, far enough that she didn't feel cornered. The feather on your doorstep last night wasn't mine. None of my enforcers leave marks like that. It's an old signal, used by hunting packs in the Eastern Territories to mark prey they intend to return for. I had it examined this morning. The craftsman who ties feathers in that particular style works exclusively for one household. Whose? He hesitated, and in that hesitation she understood that the answer mattered more than he wanted it to. Lady Marin's, the woman my mother and council favored as my match 3 years ago, the alliance Greta believed she was protecting by removing you. The kettle on the hearth began to whistle, and Etta rose smoothly to tend it, giving Sadie a moment to absorb what she'd just been told without an audience. Wren, oblivious, had moved on to stacking small river stones Etta had produced from some pocket, utterly unconcerned with the conversation happening above her head. She's still unmarried, Alaric continued, quieter now. Still part of my mother's court. If she learns Wren exists, if she understands what that means for any future claim she might still hope to press, she'll finish what Greta started. I won't let that happen. It wasn't bluster. It was the flat, unadorned certainty of a man stating the one fact in the room he had full control over. But I need you to hear what I'm about to say clearly, because I won't repeat it as a threat, and I won't dress it up as romance. Not when you've earned the right to hear plain truth instead of pretty words. Wren is safer inside my walls than she is in this cottage. Not because I doubt your ability to protect her. You've done that alone for 3 years, better than most could have. But because whoever is behind this has resources, patience, and a willingness to forge a king's seal without flinching. A cottage at the edge of a village has no walls against that. My household does. Sadie looked past him to her daughter, small and laughing softly at something Etta had said, utterly unaware that her existence had just become a political fault line capable of cracking a kingdom. The fear that rose in Sadie's chest wasn't the fear of 3 years ago. The fear of a frightened girl alone with a secret too big to carry. This fear had teeth of its own now, sharpened by motherhood into something closer to fury. "I won't be paraded into your court as a problem you're managing," she said. "If I come as myself, not hidden, not explained away, not tucked into some side wing while your mother and Lady Marin pretend I don't exist." "I wouldn't ask you to hide," Alaric said. "I spent 3 years hiding the truth without meaning to, believing a lie that let me hide it. I have no intention of repeating that mistake." "If you come to my house, you come as Ren's mother," acknowledged plainly, "and as someone under my protection that anyone in that court would be a fool to test." "And if your mother objects?" Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close to one. The first hint of humor she'd seen in him since he'd appeared at her door. "My mother will object to a great many things. She objected to my father's choice of advisors, to the cut of my coronation robes, to the placement of the throne room windows. She will survive objecting to this as well." It wasn't enough to undo 3 years of carefully built walls. But it was enough, paired with the warmth of Etta's quiet competence, and the physician's gentle, unhurried questions, and the simple fact that Alaric had not once raised his voice or made a demand he didn't immediately temper with choice, to crack something loose in Sadie's chest that she hadn't expected to feel again. The faint, unfamiliar sensation of not being entirely alone in a fight she'd been fighting by herself for 3 years. "I need to think," she said. "Not about whether the danger is real. I believe you about that. But about whether I trust what happens to us once we're behind those walls." "Take the time," Alaric said. "I'll send Etta back tomorrow, with or without me. So Ren has a familiar face regardless of what you decide, and I'll have men watching the tree line from a distance, not close enough to frighten you, close enough that nothing reaches this door without my knowing first." He left before sundown, the small retinue falling in behind him, and Sadie stood at the window long after the sound of hooves had faded, watching the place where the trees swallowed the road. Etta had pressed a small folded paper into her hand before leaving. Not a letter, but a list, written in a careful, looping hand, of herbs that helped with the restless sleep young shifter children sometimes suffered as their senses sharpened earlier than their understanding could keep pace with. It was such a small, practical kindness that Sadie found herself blinking back tears over it for reasons she couldn't entirely name. That night, after Ren had fallen asleep clutching one of the river stones Etta had given her, Sadie sat at the small table and finally allowed herself to remember. Not the letter, not the betrayal, but the years before it. The first time she'd met Alaric, not as a king, but as a stranger who'd helped her cart break free of mud on a forest road, asking nothing in return, not yet knowing who she was speaking to. The months that followed, careful and quiet, built in stolen hours between his duties and her work in the kitchens of a minor noble house. The way he used to listen, really listen, when she spoke, like her words carried weight in a world that rarely gave weight to anyone without a title. She had loved him once, before the letter taught her that loving him was dangerous. She did not know yet if what remained of that love had survived 3 years of grief disguised as rejection. But she knew, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall in the dim firelight, that the question no longer belonged only to her. Ren had a father who had searched for 3 years without knowing what he searched for, and a court full of enemies who would not stop simply because Sadie wished they would. The decision, when it finally settled in her, did not feel like surrender. It felt like the first move in a fight she intended, finally, to win. She would go, Not because Alaric asked, because her daughter deserved walls strong enough to keep her safe, and a mother strong enough to make sure those walls held, from the inside, with her own hands on the gate, rather than from a cottage at the edge of nowhere, waiting for the next feather to appear on her doorstep. In the morning, when Etta returned alone, riding a sturdy gray mare with a second mount trailing behind on a lead rope, Sadie was already waiting with 2 small bags packed, and Wren dressed warmly against the autumn chill. "I've made my decision," she said, before Etta could even dismount. "Take me to him." Etta's weathered face creased into something that might have been the first real smile Sadie had seen from her. "He'll want to hear that from you himself. But I'll admit, child, I'm glad to be the one bringing you." As they rode away from the cottage that had sheltered her for 3 years, Sadie did not look back. She kept her eyes forward, on the road, on the distant shape of towers rising pale against the morning sky, and on her daughter sitting in front of her, small and warm and utterly unafraid, riding toward a future neither of them yet understood the size of. Behind them, unseen, a figure emerged briefly from the tree line to watch the empty cottage, then turned and rode hard in the opposite direction, toward a manor house flying unfamiliar colors, carrying news that would not be welcomed kindly by whoever waited there to receive it. The castle did not look the way Sadie remembered it. She had seen it before, years ago, from the servants' entrance and the narrow back stairs reserved for kitchen staff, glimpses of polished stone and high windows caught sideways while carrying trays or scrubbing floors, never meant to be looked at directly. Now the gates opened wide before her, the gray towers rising sharp against a pale sky, and she rode through the front approach with her daughter's small hands gripping the pommel in front of her, both of them entering through the doors meant for those who belonged. Alaric was waiting in the courtyard himself, without guards flanking him, without the trappings of ceremony she'd half expected. He came forward as the horses slowed, and when he lifted Wren down from the saddle, the girl let him do it without protest, already familiar enough with him now to accept his hands without flinching. "You came," he said to Sadie, and there was something unguarded in his voice, relief mixed with disbelief, like he had spent the ride imagining every reason she might change her mind at the last moment. "I came," she agreed, sliding down without his help, needing the small victory of standing on her own ground before she let herself lean on anyone. "But I told you already, not hidden, not managed." "I haven't forgotten." He gestured toward the wide stone steps leading into the main hall, where several members of the household staff had gathered. Drawn by curiosity, they were trying poorly to disguise as busyness. "I've prepared rooms for you both in the family wing, not the guest quarters, and I've already informed the household that Wren is my daughter, acknowledged plainly, with my name behind her." "And your mother?" His jaw tightened slightly. "Waiting for you in the receiving hall. I won't pretend that conversation will be gentle, but I'll be beside you for it, and she knows better than to test me on matters I've already decided." The receiving hall was vast, in a way that made Sadie's skin prickle. High vaulted ceilings, tapestries depicting old battles and older treaties, the lingering smell of beeswax candles and cold stone. Queen Mother Isolde sat in a high-backed chair near the unlit hearth, dressed in deep burgundy, her silver-streaked hair pinned with severe precision, her face composed into the kind of neutrality that Sadie recognized immediately as a held breath rather than calm. Isolde's eyes moved first to Sadie, assessing, cataloging, the way Sadie imagined she might assess a horse she was considering purchasing. Then her gaze dropped to Wren, who stood half behind her mother's skirts, peering out with open curiosity rather than fear. Something shifted in the older woman's expression. Not warmth, not yet. But the careful blankness cracked, just slightly, into something that looked almost like grief. "She has his eyes," Isolde said quietly. "His father's eyes, my husband's eyes." She rose slowly from the chair, crossing the stone floor with the measured grace of someone who had spent a lifetime being watched. "I will not pretend, girl, that I am pleased by how this has come to pass. I favored a different match for my son. I believed 3 years ago that the alliance with Lady Marin's house would have strengthened borders that have bled my people for 2 generations. Mother, Alaric said, low warning in his voice. Let me finish. Isolde did not look away from Sadie. I am telling you this not to wound you, but because you deserve honesty rather than false sweetness from a woman who will, from this day forward, be your daughter's grandmother, whether either of us finds that comfortable. I did not order the letter forged. I want that understood clearly. But I cannot say with full conscience that I would have stopped it had I known, because I believed then that the kingdom's safety mattered more than my son's heart. Her voice wavered, just slightly, on the last words. I have had 3 years to learn how wrong that belief made me. My son grieved a love he believed had rejected him, and I let myself think that grief would fade into duty eventually. It did not. And now I am looking at a granddaughter I did not know existed, who has my husband's eyes, and I find that duty matters rather less to me than it did yesterday. Sadie did not soften easily, not after 3 years of building walls against exactly this kind of careful, regal apology. But something in the rawness of it, the admission that cost a queen something to make, loosened the tightness in her chest by a fraction. I don't need you to love me, Sadie said carefully. I need you to never again let anyone in this household decide my daughter's safety isn't worth protecting. That's the only apology that will mean anything to me. Then you have it, Isolde said, in full. And I will say so before the entire council, if that is what's required to make it binding. It was not friendship. It was not even trust, not yet. But it was a beginning. And Alaric's hand found Sadie's shoulder briefly, steady and warm. A silent acknowledgement that she had just navigated something difficult without his help, and come through it standing. The days that followed moved faster than Sadie expected. Wren adapted to the castle with the easy resilience of childhood, claiming the long gallery outside her new room as a racing track, and charming the kitchen staff into smuggling her extra honey cakes within the first week. Etta became a fixture, gentle and steady, teaching Sadie which herbs eased a young shifter's restless nights, and which court customs mattered enough to learn, and which could be safely ignored. But beneath the surface calm, the investigation into Greta's true conspirators moved with grim, deliberate pressure. Alaric brought Sadie into rooms she would once have been barred from entering, not as a courtesy, but because he insisted her perspective mattered to the search. She had lived among the household staff once, had seen alliances and resentments invisible to those who only ruled from above. It was Sadie, in fact, who noticed the pattern first. A steward who handled the kitchen accounts, a man named Corwin, whose ledgers showed unexplained gaps 3 years prior, coinciding exactly with the weeks before the forged letter and the weeks after Sadie's disappearance. He was new then, she told Alaric, poring over the old records spread across his study table. The same study, she realized with a strange jolt, where she'd once delivered trays of tea as a kitchen girl, never imagining she'd one day sit across from its owner as something closer to an equal. Greta wouldn't have trusted a stranger with something this delicate, unless he wasn't a stranger to whoever was paying him. Alaric's gaze sharpened. Corwin came to my household on Lady Marin's recommendation. Her family's steward trained him before he transferred to mine. Then he never stopped answering to her. They confronted Corwin together 2 days later, in a small chamber off the main hall, with 2 of Alaric's most trusted enforcers standing silent at the door. The man's composure cracked within minutes under Alaric's quiet, relentless questioning. Not threats, not violence. Simply the unbearable weight of a king's patient certainty that the truth would be extracted eventually, one way or another. Corwin confessed it all in a rush, like a dam giving way. He had indeed maintained correspondence with Lady Marin's household throughout his employment, had been paid handsomely to report on the king's personal affairs, had been the one to suggest Greta as the instrument for the forged letter, knowing her old loyalty to the alliance, and her susceptibility to flattering arguments about duty and pack stability. He had not known about the child. He swore that part with genuine fear in his voice, as if the existence of an heir complicated his crimes into something far beyond what he'd bargained for. Lady Marin ordered this, Alaric said, voice dangerously flat, once Corwin had been led away to a holding cell to await formal judgment. Not Greta's misplaced patriotism, not some abstract concern for the pack. A woman who wanted my crown removed every obstacle in her path 3 years ago, including the woman I loved and the child she didn't know she carried. What happens now? Sadie asked. Now, Alaric said, and something cold and final settled into his features. I summon her to answer for it, publicly, before the full council. I want every lord and lady who once whispered that you weren't good enough for this house to watch her stand trial for exactly the cruelty their whispers helped enable. That night, after Wren had fallen asleep in the new room that was slowly filling with small, accumulated evidence of a settled life, a wooden horse carved by one of the stable hands, a collection of river stones arranged carefully on the windowsill, a soft blanket Etta had sewn with tiny embroidered wolves along the border. Sadie found herself standing on the balcony outside her room, looking out over the dark sprawl of the castle grounds. Alaric joined her without announcement, the way he'd begun doing in the past week, comfortable now with a silence that didn't need to be filled with words to mean something. You didn't have to defend me to your mother the way you did, Sadie said, without looking at him. I could have managed that conversation myself. I know you could have. He leaned against the stone railing beside her, close but not touching, the careful distance he'd maintained since the first night, waiting for her to be the one to close it if she ever chose to. I wanted to anyway. Not because I doubted your strength. Because I spent 3 years failing to protect you from a lie I didn't know existed, and some part of me needed to prove, even in small moments, that I intend to do better now. You don't owe me proof every hour of every day, Alaric. Don't I? He turned to look at her then, and the moonlight caught the same scar on his cheekbone she'd noticed the first night. A small, permanent reminder of battles fought in her absence. I let 3 years pass believing a story that should have made no sense to me if I'd thought about it clearly. I should have searched harder. I should have questioned the convenience of a letter that arrived exactly when my mother and council most wanted you gone. I failed you before I ever had the chance to fight for you, and I think I will spend a long time trying to earn back the trust that failure cost. Sadie was quiet for a long moment, watching the wind move through the dark trees beyond the castle walls, the same trees that had once hidden a watching figure on the night he first found her again. I'm not the same woman who left here 3 years ago, she said finally. I don't frighten as easily. I don't trust as easily either. But I notice, Alaric, that you haven't once tried to rush me past either of those things. I won't, he said simply. Whatever this becomes between us, it will be something you choose with clear eyes, not something you fall into because a crown and a castle make refusal seem foolish. You've earned the right to choose slowly. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even particularly romantic. By the standards of grand gestures she might once have imagined for herself in another life. But it was honest, steady, and unhurried, in a way that made something in her chest ease for the first time in longer than she could remember. Not surrender, not yet, but the quiet, dawning possibility that the walls she'd built might not need to stand forever against this particular man. 3 days later, the summons went out to Lady Marin's household, demanding her presence before the full council to answer formal charges of conspiracy against the crown. The reply that came back was not the defiant refusal Alaric had expected, nor the desperate plea for mercy his advisors predicted. It was silence, 3 full days of it, followed by news that arrived at dawn, carried by a breathless rider whose face told the story before his words did. Lady Marin's manor had been found empty in the night. Every servant dismissed, every valuable removed. The lady herself gone without a trace, leaving behind only a single black feather, pinned deliberately to the door of her abandoned study. the same mark that had once been left on Sadie's threshold. "She's not running," Alaric said grimly, staring at the feather one of his enforcers had brought back wrapped carefully in cloth. "She's regrouping, and she's telling us quite clearly that she isn't finished." Lady Marin resurfaced 11 days later, and she did not come quietly. She arrived at the edge of the castle grounds at dusk, riding alone, dressed not in the fine silk Sadie remembered glimpsing in old court rumors, but in the plain riding leathers of someone who had spent recent days moving fast and far. She did not approach the gates like a fugitive seeking mercy. She approached like a woman who believed she still held a card no one else had counted. "She's asking to be brought before the council herself," the enforcer reported to Alaric, breathless from the ride back. "She says she has proof that will change everything, and she'll only present it publicly, in front of the full court." Alaric's expression had gone carefully blank in the way Sadie had learned meant he was working hard to control something dangerous beneath the surface. "Bring her in, full guard, and send word to the council, tonight, not tomorrow. Whatever she intends to say, I want it said where every lord who once doubted Sadie will be forced to hear the truth alongside the lie." Sadie's hands had gone cold the moment the enforcer mentioned proof. 3 years of carefully buried fear rose in her chest again, sharp and immediate. What could she possibly have that changes anything? Corwin already confessed. Greta already confessed. The forged letter has already been examined and matched to no royal sealmaker in this kingdom. "I don't know," Alaric admitted. "But I know Marin well enough to understand she wouldn't return into the heart of a kingdom that's hunting her without believing she held something that could still turn the tide." His hand found hers, brief and steadying. "Whatever it is, we face it together. In the hall, in front of everyone. No more hidden letters, no more conversations behind closed doors that someone else gets to control." The council chamber that night was fuller than Sadie had ever seen it. Every bench occupied. Every lord and lady of standing summoned on such short notice that several still wore traveling cloaks, dust from the road still clinging to their boots. Isolde sat at the head table beside an empty throne reserved for her son, her face composed into the same regal blankness Sadie had first met weeks ago, though something steadier had settled into it since, an alliance, however cautious, now standing firmly on Sadie's side of the room. Ren had been left safely in Edda's care, far from the chamber, though Sadie's chest ached with the absence of her daughter's small warm weight even as she understood exactly why Alaric had insisted on it. Lady Marin was led in flanked by 2 guards, though she walked with her chin lifted, refusing to look anything like a prisoner. When she finally spoke, her voice carried clear and steady across the silent hall. "I will not deny what I have done," she said. "I orchestrated the letter. I instructed Corwin. I believed, and still believe, that the kingdom's safety required an alliance stronger than sentiment, and that a king's heart should not be permitted to undo generations of careful diplomacy." Her gaze swept the room before settling finally on Sadie. "But I did not act from cruelty alone. I acted because I was promised something in return for ensuring this match between our houses succeeded. Something I have never received, and something that I believe several people in this room would prefer, remained buried." "Then speak it plainly," Alaric said, voice carrying the cold authority of a man who had stopped fearing whatever came next, the moment he decided to face it in the open. "Or be silent and face judgment for what you've already confessed to." Marin's eyes did not leave Isolde's face. "Your mother knew, my king. Not the details of the forgery. I will grant her that small mercy, since she claims it sincerely. But she knew 3 years ago that pressure was being applied to remove an unsuitable match from your life, and she chose not to ask too many questions about how that pressure was being achieved, because the result served her purposes as much as mine. The silence that followed was absolute." Sadie watched Isolde's face carefully, watched the color drain from it, watched the older woman's hands tighten on the carved arms of her chair. "That is not what I confessed to you in private," Isolde said finally, her voice tight with something between fury and old grief. "I told you I regretted not stopping it once I suspected. I never told you I orchestrated silence to serve my own ends, because I did not." "You knew enough to ask," Marin pressed. "You chose comfortable ignorance instead, the same comfortable ignorance every lord in this room enjoyed, while a woman was driven from this kingdom carrying an unborn heir. None of you bothered to wonder about." The accusation landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward through the gathered nobility, murmurs rising despite the formality of the chamber. Sadie felt the weight of dozens of eyes shifting toward her, no longer the curious, dismissive glances of a court assessing an unsuitable kitchen girl, but something heavier now: calculation, reassessment, the slow recognition that the story they thought they understood had far more cracks running through it than anyone had admitted. Alaric rose from his seat, and the murmurs died instantly under the weight of his presence. "Whatever my mother did or did not suspect 3 years ago does not absolve you of what you orchestrated," he said, voice carrying easily to every corner of the chamber. "You forged my seal. You manipulated a loyal servant into believing treachery was duty. You drove a woman carrying my child into hiding for 3 years, and when discovered, you fled rather than answer for it honestly. Whatever comfortable ignorance my mother indulged in does not change a single fact of your guilt." "Perhaps not," Marin said. And for the first time, something like genuine bitterness cracked through her composed defiance. "But it changes whether I face this alone. If I am to be punished, I want every person in this room to understand that the rot I'm accused of did not grow from nothing. It grew because this court has always valued bloodlines and alliances over the people forced to live inside the consequences of those choices. I am not the only one guilty of believing that human women and the children they bear shifters are inconveniences to be managed rather than family to be protected." Sadie felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, never that, but a strange, cold clarity. She rose from her own seat before she fully decided to, drawing every eye in the chamber toward her instead. "You're right about one thing," Sadie said, and her voice did not shake, though the entire weight of the court's attention pressed down on her like physical weight. "This rot didn't grow from nothing. It grew because people like you decided, in rooms like this one, that women like me don't matter enough to be told the truth, or asked our own preferences, or trusted with decisions about our own lives and our own children. You didn't act alone because you're uniquely cruel, Lady Marin. You acted exactly the way this court trained you to act, as though love and family are inconveniences that can be managed away with the right forged letter and the right convenient silence." She turned, slowly, taking in the rows of nobility who had gathered to watch judgment fall on someone else, many of whom, she suspected, had quietly approved of her disappearance 3 years ago without ever needing it spelled out so cruelly. "My daughter," Sadie continued, "will grow up in this court, whether any of you are comfortable with that or not. She will grow up knowing exactly what was done to remove her from her father's life before she was even born. And she will grow up watching whether this kingdom actually changes or simply punishes one woman publicly, while quietly continuing the same comfortable cruelty in private. I would rather know now which kind of court I'm raising her inside." The silence that answered her was different from the silence that had answered Marin, heavier, more uncertain, the particular discomfort of people forced to recognize their own complicity reflected back at them without the comfort of distance. Isolde rose slowly from her own seat, and when she spoke, her voice carried none of its usual regal polish, only something rawer beneath it. "I will not pretend the accusation against me is entirely without merit. I suspected enough, 3 years ago, to have asked harder questions, and I did not, because the answers might have required me to fight my own court on behalf of a woman I had already decided didn't deserve the fight. That failure is mine, and I will not hide from it simply because Lady Marin's crimes are larger than my silence." She turned to face the gathered nobility fully. "Let it be understood, by everyone in this chamber, that this court intends to be different going forward. Not because a queen commands it, but because a granddaughter of mine deserves better than the cowardice that nearly cost her a father and very nearly cost this kingdom its rightful heir. The judgment that followed took the rest of the night to settle formally, but its shape was clear within the hour. Lady Marin, stripped of title and land, exiled from the kingdom's territories under permanent decree, her household dissolved, and its remaining loyal staff absorbed into neutral service elsewhere. Corwin received a lesser sentence of hard labor and lifetime exile. His cooperation and confession weighed against his crimes. Greta, frail and genuinely remorseful by the time her own hearing came, was shown a mercy that surprised the court. Not freedom, but a quiet retirement to a distant convent. Her years of loyal service to the royal family weighed in the end against a single catastrophic choice made from misplaced belief rather than malice. It was not perfect justice. Sadie understood that even as the council chamber emptied in the small hours of the morning, exhaustion settling into her bones alongside something that felt, cautiously, like relief. 3 years could not be returned to her. The fear Wren had unknowingly grown up, shadowed by, could not be entirely undone. But the truth had been spoken aloud, in front of everyone who needed to hear it. And the court that had once made her disappearance convenient had been forced, publicly and permanently, to reckon with the cost of that convenience. Months passed before the kingdom settled fully into its new shape. Sadie spent that time learning the rhythms of a life she'd never expected to claim, not as a hidden mistress or a managed scandal, but as Wren's mother, acknowledged plainly, and as someone whose opinion mattered increasingly in rooms where decisions about the kingdom's future were made. She did not rush her own heart, despite Alaric's patient, steady presence beside her through every difficult council session and every quiet evening that followed. She let trust rebuild itself slowly, the way Etta had once taught her to brew a proper restorative tea. Not forced, not hurried, simply given the time it required to become what it was meant to be. It was Wren, in the end, who gave Sadie the final clarity she'd been circling for months. On a bright spring afternoon, watching her daughter chase Alaric across the castle gardens in some elaborate game involving imaginary dragons and a wooden sword carved by the castle's stable master, Sadie found herself laughing, really laughing, unguarded and easy, for the first time since the night a knock had come at her cottage door. Alaric caught her eye across the garden, breathless from the game, his composed kingly bearing entirely abandoned in favor of crawling on his hands and knees, while Wren shrieked with delight atop his back, and something in Sadie's chest finally, fully settled into place. That evening, after Wren had been tucked into bed with a river stone clutched in one small fist, and a story about brave queens half finished on her lips, Sadie found Alaric on the same balcony where he'd once told her she had the right to choose slowly. "I've chosen," she said simply. He turned, and the careful patience he'd maintained for months gave way, just slightly, to something hopeful and uncertain in equal measure. "Tell me." "I'm not the woman who left this castle 3 years ago believing she'd been discarded," Sadie said. "I'm not entirely the woman who walked back through those gates a few months ago either, carrying every wall I'd built to survive alone. I'm someone new, built out of both of those women, and that person is choosing you. Not because a crown makes refusal foolish. Not because Wren needs a father in the house she sleeps in every night, though I'm grateful she has one. I'm choosing you because you've spent every single day since that knock at my door proving, in small, steady ways, that you're exactly the man I believed you were before a forged letter convinced me otherwise." Alaric crossed the distance between them slowly, the same careful distance he'd maintained for months, and this time when he reached for her hand, she let him take it. "I love you," he said quietly. "I have, I think, since long before I understood what losing you would cost. I won't waste any more time proving that with patience alone. I want to build the rest of this with you, openly, publicly, as something the whole kingdom witnesses rather than something hidden in letters and lies." The kingdom celebrated their formal union as spring gave way to summer, a ceremony held not in secrecy, but in the full light of the same council chamber where judgment had once been passed. Every lord and lady who had once whispered about unsuitable matches, now standing as witnesses to a different kind of truth. Isolde herself placed the ceremonial circlet of the Luna's house upon Sadie's brow, her hands steady, her voice clear as she spoke the old words of welcome to a daughter she had once been too comfortable in her own silence to protect. Wren, dressed in a small gown that matched her mother's in color, if not in grandeur, stood at the front of the gathered court, no longer hidden, no longer a secret to be managed, but the acknowledged heir of a kingdom that had finally, fully reckoned with what nearly cost her everything. Sadie stood beside Alaric that day, not as a frightened girl rescued from hardship, nor as a quiet victim owed sympathy, but as a woman who had rebuilt herself from the wreckage of betrayal into someone capable of standing in front of an entire court and demanding it become better. The walls she'd built 3 years ago to survive alone had not disappeared. They had simply transformed into something sturdier, not walls to keep love out, but the steady foundation of a life she had chosen with clear eyes, exactly as she'd promised herself she would. The kingdom moved forward from that day, changed in ways both small and significant. A council more willing to question convenient silences. A queen mother more willing to fight for the people inside her family, rather than only the alliances surrounding it. And a young heir growing up secure in the knowledge that she had never been an inconvenience to be managed, but a truth worth protecting from the very beginning. And on quiet evenings, long after the formal ceremonies had faded into memory, Sadie would sometimes find herself on that same balcony, watching the trees that had once hidden a watching enemy now simply sway peacefully in ordinary wind, and feel, with quiet and complete certainty, that the life she'd fought so hard to reclaim had finally, fully become her own.